Alien billionaire sees human janitor cleaning her disabled child. What she did next was. The hum of the palace was a constant, a low-frequency thrum that vibrated through the soles of Richard's worn work boots, a steady reminder of the immense, sleeping machine he served. It was a sound he had grown accustomed to over the past few months, a constant companion in the sterile, silent corridors of the private wing. Here, high above the neon-drenched canyons of Oryx Prime, the air was filtered to perfection. The light was always soft and indirect, and the silence was as polished and expensive as the silver inlay on the walls. Richard pushed his cleaning cart, its wheels whispering over the flawless marble floors, his movements economical and practiced. He was a ghost in this jeweled cage, a necessary but invisible functionary, and he preferred it that way. The less he was noticed, the more secure his position, and security was a luxury he hadn't known for a very long time. His assigned sector was the personal wing of Janice, the enigmatic billionaire who owned not just this spire, but the entire corporate empire that bore her name. He had only ever seen her from a distance, a fleeting glimpse of shimmering golden hair and amethyst skin as she swept past, her presence a whirlwind of authority and quiet, intimidating power. His primary responsibility, however, was the maintenance of the areas surrounding the child's quarters, a suite of rooms that were even quieter than the rest of the wing, a place where the pervasive silence felt less like peace and more like a carefully maintained vacuum. Tonight, the usual sterile order was broken. As he approached the entrance to the nursery, he heard a small, distressed sound, a soft, choked whimper that was almost lost in the ever-present hum of the spire. It was the sound of a child in pain, a sound that cut through the sterile perfection of the palace and went straight to his heart. He paused, his hand tightening on the handle of his cart. The protocols were clear. He was to be invisible, to see nothing, to hear nothing outside the scope of his duties. But the whimper came again, a fragile, desperate plea, and the protocols were damned. He pushed the cart to the side and stepped cautiously through the archway into the nursery. The room was a monument to wealth, filled with holographic toys that shimmered in the air and soft, glowing mobiles that projected entire galaxies onto the high ceiling. In the center of it all was the source of the sound. The child, Bella, was strapped into her hover chair, her small, purple-skinned body frail and still. A nutrient line attached to her arm had malfunctioned, leaking a sticky, foul-smelling fluid onto her and the pristine white cushion of her chair. Her large silver eyes, wide with a silent, helpless misery, were fixed on the mess. Two of the palace's high-priced medical attendants stood nearby, their expressions a mixture of annoyance and disgust as they debated which of them should be responsible for the unpleasant task of cleaning it up. Their voices were low and condescending, their concern not for the crying child, but for the inconvenience she represented. Richard's jaw tightened. He had seen this kind of casual cruelty before in the orphanages of his youth, the cold indifference of those paid to care. Without a second thought, he crossed the room, his worn gray uniform a stark contrast to the attendants' crisp white tunics. He knelt before the hover chair, ignoring the attendants' startled, indignant protests. "Hey there," he said softly, his voice a low, gentle rumble that was entirely out of place in the cold, formal atmosphere of the room. He didn't look at the mess, he looked at Bella. He met her shimmering, tear-filled eyes, and for the first time he offered her a simple, genuine smile. "Looks like we've had a bit of a spill. Let's get that sorted out, shall we?" The child stared at him, her whimpering subsiding into a series of small, hitching breaths. No one ever spoke to her like this, with such simple, direct kindness. Richard took a clean, soft cloth from a pouch on his belt and a small container of warm, sanitized water from his cart. He worked with a quiet, practiced efficiency, his rough, scarred hands surprisingly gentle as he unhooked the malfunctioning nutrient line and began to carefully clean the sticky fluid from the girl's delicate skin. He worked in silence, his movements calm and reassuring, treating the task not as a disgusting chore but as a necessary act of comfort. He cleaned the chair, replaced the soiled cushion with a fresh one from a nearby cabinet, and re-established the nutrient line, ensuring it was secure and functioning properly. All the while, he hummed a quiet, tuneless melody, an old lullaby he hadn't thought of in years. When he was finished, he took another clean, dry cloth and gently wiped the lingering tears from Bella's cheeks. He looked into her big silver eyes and gave her a small, conspiratorial wink. There we go, good as new. For the first time, a flicker of something other than sadness appeared in the child's eyes. It was a spark of curiosity, of wonder. From the shadows of an adjoining observation room, behind a one-way pane of crystalline glass, Janice watched the entire scene unfold. Her breath was caught in her throat, her heart pounding a strange, unfamiliar rhythm against her ribs. She had been observing the nursery remotely, a habit born of years of anxiety, and had seen the initial malfunction. She had been about to summon her chief of staff to reprimand the negligent attendants when the janitor had appeared. She watched as this low-level human employee, this man in a faded gray uniform, did what her entire staff of highly paid specialists had failed to do. He had not just cleaned up a mess, he had offered comfort. He had treated her daughter not as a medical case or a dynastic burden, but as a person, a small child who was scared and needed help. He had knelt before her, meeting her at her own level, his actions radiating a warmth and a simple, unadorned dignity that was utterly foreign in her world of calculated transactions and superficial courtesies. She saw the gentleness in his rough hands, the patience in his weary eyes, and she felt a crack appear in the icy facade she had so carefully constructed around her heart. No one had ever shown her child such tenderness, not the legions of doctors, not an army of nannies, not even herself. In that moment, watching the poor human janitor comfort her disabled daughter, the richest and most powerful woman on Oryx Prime felt a profound and unsettling pang of something she had almost forgotten existed: hope. She watched him give her daughter that small, conspiratorial wink, and saw the faint, curious light it sparked in Bella's eyes, and she knew, with a certainty that shook her to her very core, that this simple, insignificant man possessed something that her vast fortune could never, ever buy. Her initial shock slowly gave way to a deep, consuming fascination. This was an anomaly, an unexpected variable in the sterile, predictable equation of her life, and she found herself needing to understand it. The next day, she made a quiet, discreet inquiry, pulling up Richard's file on her private terminal. The data was sparse and unremarkable: a refugee from a failed Earth colony, a history of manual labor jobs, no family, no notable commendations, no criminal record. He was, by all accounts, a nobody, just another piece of faceless interstellar flotsam that had washed up on the shores of her gilded world. And yet, what she had seen with her own eyes contradicted the cold, impersonal data on the screen. There was a depth to him, a quiet strength that his file could not capture. Acting on an impulse she didn't fully understand, she issued a new directive, reassigning him permanently to the private wing, his duties now focused exclusively on the general upkeep of the nursery and its adjoining areas. She told herself it was a practical measure, a way to ensure her daughter's immediate environment was maintained by someone who had demonstrated a modicum of competence and compassion. But deep down, she knew it was more than that. It was an experiment. She wanted to see him again, to observe him, to understand the source of the quiet, unassuming light he carried within him. The change in his duties was subtle at first. Richard simply found himself spending more of his shift in the quiet, sun-drenched rooms of Bella's world. He cleaned with his usual quiet efficiency, but now he was a consistent presence in the child's life, not just a fleeting shadow in the hallways. Bella, in turn, began to watch him, her large silver eyes tracking his movements as he polished the floors or cleaned the large observation windows. The two negligent attendants had been quietly and permanently reassigned, replaced by a new team that was far more attentive, but they still maintained a professional, clinical distance from their charge. Richard was different. He didn't try to engage her in the forced, overly cheerful manner of the nannies. He simply existed in her space, a calm, steady presence. He would sometimes catch her eye and offer a small, simple smile, a silent acknowledgement that he saw her, and slowly, hesitantly, she began to smile back. A few days into his new assignment, he was cleaning a small spill near her play area when one of her holographic toys, a shimmering, ethereal bird, malfunctioned and phased out of existence. Bella let out a small, frustrated sigh, a sound Richard was beginning to recognize. He looked over at her, then at the blank space where the bird had been. He put down his cleaning cloth, and with his rough, calloused fingers, he began to make a shadow puppet on the wall, a simple flapping bird created by the intersection of his hands and the soft light from the window. Bella's eyes widened, her attention completely captured. She had never seen anything so simple, so real. She watched, mesmerized, as Richard's bird flew and swooped across the wall, a creature of pure, uncomplicated imagination. From her observation room, Janice watched, her hand resting on the cool glass, a storm of conflicting emotions warring within her. She saw the rapt expression on her daughter's face, a look of genuine, unadulterated delight that was so rare it made her heart ache. She saw the janitor, this man who had nothing, giving her daughter a gift of simple joy that all the holographic wonders in the galaxy had failed to provide. A dangerous, unfamiliar feeling began to take root in her heart, a feeling of gratitude that was so intense it bordered on something far more personal, far more complicated. She was the master of this universe, a woman who controlled markets and toppled governments, but in the face of this simple, profound human connection, she felt a sudden, terrifying vulnerability. The janitor was no longer just an employee. He was becoming something else, a quiet, unassuming force that was slowly, inexorably beginning to dismantle the walls around her perfectly controlled world. The sound of Bella's laughter became a fragile, precious new element in the quiet ecosystem of the private wing, a recurring melody that began to slowly erode the sterile silence of the palace. It was a sound that drew Janice like a moth to a flame, pulling her away from her endless cycle of corporate warfare and strategic acquisitions. She found herself manufacturing more and more reasons to be present for these small moments of joy, her business empire momentarily forgotten in the face of a simple card trick or a funny voice Richard used while reading a story. One evening, long after Bella's laughter had subsided into the quiet, even breathing of sleep, Richard was tidying the playroom when he found Janice standing by the entrance to Bella's bedroom, her imposing figure softened by the dim light. The powerful CEO was gone, replaced by a mother watching her child sleep. She hadn't noticed him at first, her attention completely absorbed by the small, peaceful form in the bed. When she finally turned, he saw an exhaustion in her violet eyes that went far beyond the weariness of a long workday. It was a deep, soul-crushing fatigue that had been her constant companion for years. Without the armor of her authority, she seemed almost fragile, a stark contrast to her powerful public persona. She gestured for him to join her in the small sitting area adjacent to Bella's room, a space filled with soft furnishings and muted colors that felt strangely normal in the otherwise alien opulence of the palace. They sat in a comfortable silence for a long moment, the only sound the faint, rhythmic pulse of the city's life support systems far below. "The doctors were never able to give me a definitive diagnosis," Janice said suddenly, her voice a low murmur, as if speaking the words aloud might shatter the fragile peace of the room. "They called it a degenerative neuromuscular condition, a 1 in a billion genetic anomaly. They offered treatments to manage the symptoms, to make her comfortable, but they never offered any hope for a cure. For years, I have poured trillions of credits into research, funded entire medical institutes, all in the desperate hope of finding something, anything that could help her. But all my wealth, all my power, it was all useless. It couldn't buy my daughter the simple ability to walk, to run in the gardens." As she spoke, the mask of the ruthless billionaire crumbled completely, revealing the raw, aching vulnerability of a mother terrified for her child. Richard listened without interrupting, his presence a quiet, steady anchor in her sea of despair. He didn't offer platitudes or false assurances. He simply listened, his patient hazel eyes filled with an understanding that transcended words, species, and the immense social chasm between them. When she finally fell silent, her gaze lost in the shadows of the room, he said, "She knows you love her. When you walk into the room, she looks for you. That's not useless. That's everything." His simple, honest words struck a chord deep within her, a note of comfort that all her highly paid consultants had never managed to sound. In that shared moment of quiet vulnerability, a new and profound bond was forged between them, something far deeper than the contractual arrangement of an employer and her attendant. This newfound emotional intimacy began to subtly reshape their daily interactions, replacing the last vestiges of formality with an easy, comfortable familiarity. Richard, sensing Janice's deep-seated loneliness and her awkwardness around her own daughter, began to gently orchestrate moments that included all three of them. He unearthed a simple board game from his own meager belongings, a relic from Earth with a colorful spinner and small plastic pieces, its rules so simple they could be explained in under a minute. One afternoon, he set it up on a low table in the playroom, and with some gentle coaxing, encouraged Bella to use the fine motor controls on her hoverchair to operate the spinner. Janice entered the room, a data slate in her hand, her mind clearly on some distant corporate battle, but she stopped short at the scene before her. Her daughter, who often struggled to engage with the complex holographic games designed for her, was utterly captivated, her silver eyes wide with concentration as she waited for her turn. Richard, seeing Janice hovering in the doorway, looked up and smiled. "There's room for one more player," he said, his tone casual, an open invitation that was impossible to refuse. Hesitantly, Janice put down her data slate and knelt on the floor beside them, her long limbs folding with an unpracticed awkwardness. Richard explained the rules to her as if she were just another player, not the most powerful woman on the planet, and soon the vast playroom was filled with the small, almost forgotten sounds of a family at play. The flick of the spinner, the quiet laughter from Bella as Richard's piece was sent back to the start, and the surprisingly competitive glint that appeared in Janice's eyes as she moved her own piece toward the finish line. For that brief, sun-drenched hour, they were not a billionaire, a janitor, and a disabled child. They were just three people, sharing a moment of simple, uncomplicated happiness, a small island of warmth in the cold, glittering expanse of the palace. It was into this fragile, developing sanctuary that a shadow from Janice's past arrived, an unwelcome intrusion of the cold, calculating world she was trying to escape. Zyler, her former consort and a senior executive on her corporate board, announced his visit with a polished, almost threatening politeness. He was a striking example of the Oryxian elite, handsome in a sharp, predatory way, with flawless skin the color of pale lavender and eyes as cold and gray as a winter sky. He moved with an innate arrogance, his expensive, tailored suit a silent testament to his family's ancient wealth and influence. He claimed the purpose of his visit was twofold: to discuss the final stages of a critical off-world merger, and of course to see how his dearest Bella was faring. From the moment he swept into the private wing, his presence felt like a discordant note in the new harmony Richard had helped to create. He greeted Janice with a possessive kiss on the cheek that she coolly tolerated, and he offered Bella a condescending pat on the head, his gaze barely registering the child herself before it settled, with a sharp, analytical focus on Richard. He watched the easy, familiar way Richard interacted with both mother and child, the shared smiles, the quiet understanding that flowed between them, and his smooth, charming facade tightened almost imperceptibly at the edges. During his entire visit, he treated Richard not as a person, but as a piece of furniture that had been inexplicably allowed to speak, his every word dripping with a casual, dismissive contempt. "A human," he remarked to Janice, his voice loud enough for Richard to hear, a slight, cruel smile playing on his lips. "How wonderfully quaint. You must find its simple, rustic charm to be a refreshing novelty." The insult was clear, a deliberate barb designed to remind Richard of his place and to sow a seed of doubt in Janice's mind about her unconventional choices. Zyler saw the burgeoning emotional connection not as a source of healing and happiness, but as a dangerous, exploitable weakness in Janice's otherwise impenetrable armor. And as he departed, his cold gray eyes held a new, calculating glint that promised trouble on the horizon. Zyler's visit cast a long, cold shadow over the fragile warmth that had begun to blossom in the private wing. His casual, venomous words had been a stark reminder of the vast, chasm-like gulf that separated Richard's world from Janice's, and the calculating look in his eyes had promised a future complication that Richard could feel in his bones. Janice, for her part, became more withdrawn in the days following his departure, the easy laughter and shared moments replaced by a renewed, almost frantic focus on her work. She erected her walls of authority once more, her interactions with Richard becoming more formal, tinged with a familiar, professional distance. He understood her retreat. Zyler had been a representative of her real world, the world of power and politics, a world where a human janitor was not just an anomaly, but a liability. The board game sat on its shelf, untouched, a silent testament to a brief, idyllic interlude that now seemed to be over. Richard felt a profound sense of loss, not for any romantic notion he might have harbored, but for the simple, genuine connection they had all shared, a connection that now felt as fragile as a dream upon waking. He redoubled his focus on his duties, his movements once again becoming those of an invisible servant, but he could not ignore the change in Bella. The light that had begun to dance in her eyes had dimmed, her laughter once again becoming a rare and precious commodity. She watched Janice's prolonged absences with a quiet, sad resignation that was heartbreaking to witness. The storm broke on a day like any other. Richard was in the playroom with Bella, trying to coax a smile from her with a new shadow puppet, a clumsy-looking creature he dubbed a grack beast, when a series of sharp, urgent chimes echoed from Janice's private office. Moments later, she swept into the room, her face pale, her usual regal composure shattered by a raw, naked panic. She was clutching a data slate, her knuckles white, her violet eyes wide with a terror that Richard had never seen before. "They're trying to take her from me," she whispered, her voice a ragged, broken sound. "They're trying to take my company, my home, everything." The words tumbled out of her in a frantic, disjointed stream. Zyler, it seemed, had made his move. He had convened an emergency meeting of the board, presenting them with a carefully constructed dossier of security breaches, financial irregularities, and operational lapses, all subtly engineered by him over the past few weeks. The centerpiece of his argument, however, was a piece of manufactured evidence so cruel and so audacious that Richard could barely comprehend it. Heavily doctored security footage that depicted him as a threat to Bella. The footage, a grotesque twisting of his gentle interactions with the child, showed him handling her roughly, his kind gestures edited into something menacing and sinister. It was a lie, a monstrous, unforgivable lie, but in the cold, cynical world of corporate warfare, it was the perfect weapon. Zyler's argument was that Janice's judgment had been compromised, that in her grief and desperation, she had allowed a dangerous, unstable element into the very heart of her home, jeopardizing not only her daughter's safety, but the stability of the entire company. He was painting her as an unfit mother and an incompetent leader, and was petitioning the board to have her removed from her position, and to have Bella placed under a corporate-appointed guardianship, a guardianship that would, of course, be controlled by him. The sheer, diabolical brilliance of the attack was breathtaking. Zyler was not just trying to seize her company, he was trying to sever the one human connection that had given her a reason to fight for it. Richard looked from Janice's terrified face to Bella, who was watching the scene with a wide-eyed, silent understanding that was far beyond her years. The child seemed to grasp the magnitude of the threat, the impending darkness that was about to swallow her small, fragile world. In that moment, Richard's own fear, his own sense of powerlessness, was burned away by a surge of pure protective rage. He was no one, a janitor with no power and no influence, but he would not stand by and watch this happen. He would not let this lie destroy the two people who had, against all odds, shown him a kindness he had long since forgotten existed. He stepped forward, his presence a sudden, solid anchor in the swirling chaos of Janice's panic. "He's using me to get to you," he said, his voice quiet but firm, cutting through her fear with a simple, undeniable clarity. "That means I'm the one who can prove he's lying." Janice stared at him, her mind, so used to thinking in terms of assets and leverage, struggling to comprehend his meaning. "How?" she asked, her voice trembling. "It's my word against his. They will never believe a janitor over a senior board member." "No," Richard countered, his gaze unwavering. "They won't believe me. But they might believe you if you fight back. Not like a CEO, but like a mother." He laid out a simple, desperate plan. Instead of trying to fight Zyler on his own terms, in the sterile, corrupt world of the boardroom, she needed to change the battlefield. She needed to bring the truth to them, to show them the real relationship between him and Bella, to expose the lie not with counterarguments and legal maneuvering, but with the simple, undeniable evidence of their shared affection. He proposed that she invite a small, select group of the more moderate board members, those who were not already firmly in Zyler's pocket, to a private, informal gathering at the palace. She would not present it as a defense, but as a simple, personal appeal. She would let them see for themselves the truth of the situation. It was a wild, almost insane gamble, a move that went against every ruthless, predatory instinct she had honed over a lifetime of corporate survival. It required her to show vulnerability, to appeal to a sense of decency that she wasn't even sure her board members possessed. But as she looked at Richard's steady, determined face, and then at her daughter's fearful eyes, she knew it was the only move she had left. It was a move based not on power, but on trust, a trust in the quiet, unassuming human who had, in a few short months, become the most important person in her universe. Later that night, long after an emotionally exhausted Bella had been put to bed, Janice found Richard in the palace's vast, silent biodome, a lush, climate-controlled garden filled with the shimmering, bioluminescent flora of a dozen different worlds. He was standing before a grove of moonpetal flowers, their silvery blue blossoms glowing softly in the simulated twilight. The air was warm and thick with the scent of alien earth and sweet nectar. She stood beside him, the silence between them no longer a sign of distance, but of a deep, shared understanding. "They are coming tomorrow," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "3 of them. Vorlag the reptilian is the oldest on the board. He values stability above all else. The other 2 are younger, more ambitious, but not without a sense of honor. If I can convince them, they might be enough to sway the vote." She looked at him then, her violet eyes luminous in the soft glow of the flowers. "I am placing my entire world in your hands, Richard, a penniless human janitor from a dead world. My corporate advisors would call me a fool." He turned to face her, the immense height difference between them seeming to vanish in the intimacy of the moment. "They would be wrong," he said, his voice soft but filled with an unshakable certainty. He reached out, his calloused, work-roughened hand gently cupping her cheek. Her amethyst skin was impossibly soft against his. "You are the strongest person I have ever met, but even the strongest people need someone to stand with them." In the quiet, fragrant darkness of the garden, surrounded by the light of 1,000 alien flowers, Janice leaned in and pressed her lips to his. The kiss was soft, hesitant at first, a question asked in a language that transcended species and station, and in his gentle, steady response she found her answer. It was a kiss not of passion, but of pure, profound connection, a silent acknowledgement of the bond that had grown between them, a bond forged in shared moments of laughter, of vulnerability, and of a fierce, protective love for the small, fragile child who was the center of their universe. In that moment, she was not a billionaire, and he was not a janitor. They were simply 2 souls, finding refuge in each other against the coming storm. The fragile warmth of their first kiss lingered in the cool, blossom-scented air of the biodome, a silent, momentous event that had irrevocably altered the space between them. When Janice finally drew back, her violet eyes, now cleared of their desperate fear, held a new and unfamiliar light, not the cold fire of a corporate predator, but the fierce, burning intensity of a protector. The moment of vulnerability had not broken her. It had forged her into something stronger, something more resolute. The battle for her company was no longer a strategic game of profit and loss. It had become a deeply personal war to defend the small, fragile sanctuary she and Richard had built around her daughter. She rose from the bench, the soft silk of her gown whispering around her as she began to pace before the grove of moon-petal flowers, her mind already shifting from the emotional revelation of the past few minutes to the cold, hard logistics of the fight ahead. The transformation was breathtaking to watch. The gentle, uncertain woman who had confessed her deepest fears was gone, and in her place stood the titan of industry Richard had only ever glimpsed, her every movement radiating a formidable, calculated energy. She had not retreated behind her walls of power, but was now wielding that power with a purpose that was both terrifying and magnificent. "Zyler is not a fool," she began, her voice a low, dangerous hum that seemed to vibrate with controlled fury. "He would not have made his move without believing he had already won. His financial attacks are designed to create panic and bleed my resources, forcing me into a defensive position. The doctored footage is the public justification, the moral high ground from which he will rally the board to oust me. He is strangling my empire from the outside while poisoning it from within, a classic pincer movement." She spoke of corporate warfare with the same detached precision a general might speak of troop movements, her mind a whirlwind of strategy and counter-strategy. For a moment, Richard felt a renewed sense of the immense gulf that separated their worlds, the sheer scale of the conflict she navigated daily feeling as alien to him as the shimmering flora of the garden. He was a janitor, a man whose greatest daily struggles involved stubborn scuff marks and overflowing refuse containers. But then he looked at the sleeping face of Bella, so peaceful in the silvery light, and he understood that the stakes were exactly the same for both of them, the safety and happiness of this one small child. He had a place in this fight, not as a strategist, but as its anchor, its moral compass. "They expect you to fight with money and leverage because that's the only language they understand," he said, his voice cutting through her stream of tactical analysis with a simple, grounded clarity. "They've planned for every corporate move you could possibly make, but they haven't planned for the truth. They don't expect that. They probably don't even believe it exists anymore." His words stopped her packing. She turned to face him, a flicker of surprise in her eyes. He was right. Her entire life had been spent in a world of shadows and mirrors, of carefully constructed narratives and convenient lies. The simple, unassailable power of the plain truth was a weapon she had long since forgotten she possessed. The original security footage, she breathed, the idea taking root in her mind and blossoming into a concrete plan. "The raw, undoctored data from the moment you first entered the playroom. If I can present that to the board, it would expose Zyler's entire conspiracy as a fabrication. It would destroy his credibility and turn his allies against him." The path forward was suddenly clear, a single, brilliant stroke that could sever the head of the serpent. But her optimism was immediately tempered by a harsh reality. "It won't be that easy," she continued, her brow furrowing in concentration. Zyler would have anticipated this. The primary and secondary archives will have been purged or overwritten with the altered data. His chief of security is loyal to him. Any attempt I make to access the deep storage core will trigger a dozen alarms, and he will use that as further proof that I am trying to cover my tracks. We need a ghost, someone who can slip through the cracks of the system, someone who doesn't officially exist to people like him. She pulled up a holographic interface on her wristcom, projecting a schematic of the palace's data network into the air between them. A list of high-level personnel scrolled by, faces of Oryxians in severe, professional attire, each one a potential traitor, each one a risk she could not afford to take. She dismissed them one by one, her expression growing more grim with each passing name. They were all part of the machine, cogs in a system built on loyalty to power and wealth, and they would never risk their positions for a principle. Richard watched the parade of sterile corporate faces, a sea of strangers, and realized Janice was looking in the wrong place. She was looking for a powerful ally, a person of influence, but their greatest strength lay in the very thing Zyler saw as their greatest weakness. their connection to the unseen, unnoticed underbelly of the palace. He let his own mind drift back, not to the grand halls and executive offices, but to the monotonous gray corridors of the service levels, to the quiet moments between his cleaning routines. He remembered the faces of the other service workers, the droids, the low-level technicians, a vast, invisible army that kept the glittering spire running. And from that sea of memories, one face emerged with perfect clarity. "There's a woman," he said slowly, pulling the memory into focus. "Her name is Lyra. She's a junior data core technician. Quiet, always looks like she's afraid of her own shadow." Janice looked up from her schematic, her expression skeptical. "A junior technician? Richard, we need a master hacker, not an apprentice." But Richard shook his head, insistent. "You're not hearing me. People like Xyler, they don't see people like Lyra. They walk past her every day and she's just part of the background, but she sees them. She sees everything." He recounted the small, almost insignificant moment from his first weeks on the job, when a pompous executive had cornered him, his voice dripping with condescension, and Lyra, from across the hall at her diagnostic station, had subtly diverted a maintenance droid, creating a brief, chaotic distraction that allowed Richard to slip away unnoticed. It was a tiny act of solidarity, a flicker of defiance in a place where defiance was unthinkable. It was the act of someone who hated the arrogance of the powerful. "She helped me for no reason," he finished. "That means she has a conscience, and that makes her more trustworthy than anyone on your list." The plan was a desperate, long shot, and every instinct Janice had honed over a lifetime of corporate survival screamed against it. Trusting their entire future to a low-level, unknown variable was a gamble of unprecedented proportions. But as she looked into Richard's earnest, steady eyes, she knew he was right. Her own methods had led her into this trap. It was time to try his. "I will summon her to my office at once," she declared, her hand already moving toward her comm. "No," Richard said firmly, placing a gentle hand on her arm to stop her. "That's an order, not an invitation. It will put her on record and it will terrify her into silence. I know her world, Janice. Let me go to her. Let me talk to her as an equal, not as a summons from on high." The request was a profound test of her newfound trust in him, asking her to completely relinquish control of the most critical moment in their fight. She hesitated for a long second, her internal battle raging, before she finally gave a slow, deliberate nod. In that moment, they were no longer a billionaire and a janitor. They were true partners, each trusting the other's strengths in a way that transcended rank and species. Richard found Lyra in a sterile, windowless canteen deep in the service levels of the spire, a place of gray tables and humming nutrient dispensers that felt a universe away from the sun-drenched gardens above. She was sitting alone, nursing a cup of steaming liquid, and when she saw him approaching, a jolt of pure panic shot through her eyes. The rumors about the human spy had clearly reached even these forgotten depths. Her first instinct was to bolt, her body tensing to flee, but Richard kept his distance, his posture open and non-threatening. He didn't begin with the truth about Xyler or his desperate request for help. He began with a memory. "I never had a chance to thank you," he said, his voice quiet and calm. "A few months ago in the West Corridor, Executive Draken, you rerouted a cleaning droid." The specific memory caught her completely off guard, disarming her. Her fear was replaced by a wary confusion. No one ever noticed the small things she did. "I just wanted you to know that I saw you," he continued, "and that I was grateful." He let the words hang in the air, a bridge of shared humanity built between them in the cold, sterile room. Then, in a low, even voice, he told her everything. He told her about Xyler's lies, about the doctored footage, and about Janice's impossible fight against her own board. He didn't ask for her help. He simply laid the truth before her, a stark and dangerous offering. Lyra listened, her body trembling, her mind clearly torn between the primal instinct for self-preservation and something else, a deeper, older anger that Richard's story had begun to stir. The name Xyler was the key, the spark that lit the fuse. When Richard finished, she was silent for a long time, her gaze fixed on the gray tabletop, her knuckles white as she gripped her cup. "My father," she began, her voice a raw, shaking whisper that was thick with a lifetime of grief and rage. He was an inventor. He created a navigational algorithm that was decades ahead of its time. Zyler's family wanted it. They offered him a pittance, a fraction of what it was worth. When he refused to sell his life's work for their pocket change, Zyler destroyed him. He used his family's legal team to bury my father in patent challenges, draining his resources. Then he bribed my father's business partner, stole the company from within, and publicly branded my father as a fraud. Tears streamed down her face, hot and silent. My father died a few years later, a broken man who believed he was a failure. Zyler didn't just ruin him, he erased him from history. I took this job, this miserable, invisible job, so I could be inside the company that let it happen, just to remind myself every day of what they took from me. She finally looked up at Richard, and the fear in her eyes had been burned away, replaced by a cold, diamond-hard resolve. They want to erase you too, to make you into something you're not just so they can win. I won't let it happen again. She stood up, her small frame seeming to possess a newfound strength. I will help you, not for Janice, not even for you. I'm going to do it for my father. A fierce, triumphant hope surged through Richard. Lyra leaned closer, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. The main security archives are a fortress, but this spire is old. There are legacy systems, forgotten back doors that the new security protocols don't even monitor. I know one. A direct access terminal to the raw data stream before it's processed and compressed, before it can be edited. She had just handed them the key, the one weapon that could bring Zyler's entire conspiracy crashing down. The plan, born in the quiet sanctuary of the biodome and solidified in the sterile anonymity of a service-level canteen, was put into motion under the oppressive, humming silence of the palace's deep night cycle. It was a three-pronged assault, a desperate gambit that pitted their small, unconventional alliance against the monolithic power of Zyler's corporate machine. From the command center of her private office, Janice became a ghost in her own system, her fingers flying across a holographic interface as she waged a silent, invisible war. She became the orchestrator of chaos, initiating a series of carefully calibrated diversions designed to draw the all-seeing eyes of Zyler's security team away from their true target. A cascade of minor, irritating system failures was triggered in the spire's commercial sectors, flickering lights in the luxury boutiques, temperature fluctuations in the high-end restaurants, data stream interruptions in the financial district, small fires that required immediate attention and pulled personnel away from the core. Simultaneously, she launched a strategic financial counterattack, a bold and aggressive move on the Galactic Stock Exchange that targeted one of Zyler's family's most vulnerable assets, forcing him and his inner circle into an emergency damage control meeting. While Janice fought with algorithms and credits, Richard and Lyra became literal ghosts, descending into the forgotten bowels of the palace, a world of darkness and groaning machinery that existed in stark contrast to the glittering perfection of the levels above. Richard led the way, his janitor's uniform a perfect camouflage in this industrial labyrinth, his knowledge of the service corridors, the ventilation shafts, and the old, decommissioned transit tubes proving to be an invaluable map. Lyra followed close behind, a data slate clutched in her hands, her small frame tense with a mixture of terror and a grim, burning resolve that seemed to hold her fear at bay. Their journey was a descent into the spire's subconscious, a trek through a mechanical underworld that the wealthy inhabitants above never knew existed. They navigated massive, echoing chasms filled with the roar of atmospheric processors, squeezed through tight maintenance crawlspaces thick with the smell of ozone and hot metal, and scurried across narrow catwalks suspended over abyssal drops that seemed to fall away into the planet's very core. This was Richard's world, and he moved through it with a quiet, confident grace that was utterly alien to the man who pushed a cleaning cart through silent, opulent halls. He pointed out the pressure sensors to avoid, the locations of the audio pickups, and the patrol routes of the automated sanitation drones. his whispered instructions a lifeline for Lyra in the overwhelming darkness. Twice they were forced to press themselves into shadowy alcoves as the heavy, rhythmic tread of a security patrol passed by, the beams of their flashlights cutting sharp, sterile patterns into the gloom just meters from their hiding place. During one of these heart-stopping moments, as the patrol's footsteps receded into the distance, Lyra's nerve almost broke. A wave of trembling washed over her, the sheer, crushing weight of what she was doing threatening to overwhelm her. Richard, sensing her panic, simply placed a steadying hand on her shoulder, a small, grounding gesture of solidarity that spoke volumes in the oppressive silence. He didn't offer empty words of encouragement. He just waited, his calm, patient presence a silent promise that she was not alone in this terrifying endeavor. The gesture worked. She took a deep, shuddering breath, her resolve hardening once more, and gave him a sharp, determined nod to continue. Their destination was a small, long-forgotten maintenance hub tucked away behind a decommissioned power conduit, a dusty, tomb-like chamber that hadn't seen an organic life form in decades. In the center of the room, like an altar from a forgotten age, sat the legacy terminal. It was a clunky, archaic piece of technology, its casing yellowed with age, its screen dark and lifeless. This was Lyra's battlefield. She connected her data slate to the ancient interface, and the screen flickered to life, bathing her face in a soft, green glow as lines of archaic code began to scroll past. "I'm in," she whispered, her voice a mixture of awe and trepidation. The raw data stream is unfiltered here, completely bypassing Xyler's security loops. It's like a fire hose of information, everything from the last 50 years. As her fingers flew across the interface of her slate, translating the ancient code into a language the modern system could understand, a new alarm suddenly blared in Janice's office hundreds of levels above them. Xyler's security chief, a notoriously paranoid and ruthlessly efficient Oryxian, had detected the unauthorized power draw from the decommissioned sector. Though he didn't know the exact location, he knew someone was tampering with the Spire's oldest systems. A new wave of counter-intrusion protocols was launched, digital bloodhounds sent sniffing through the network, trying to triangulate the source of the anomaly. "They know someone's in the old network," Janice's voice came, a tense, distorted whisper through Richard's calm bead. "They're trying to lock me out. I can't hold them off for long. You need to hurry." The pressure in the small, dusty room became immense, a palpable, suffocating force. Lyra's face was a mask of intense concentration, sweat beading on her forehead as she fought against time and Xyler's digital phantoms. The raw data was a chaotic, swirling torrent, and finding the single, specific moment of Richard's first encounter with Bella was like trying to find one specific drop of water in an ocean. She built a series of filters, isolating dates, locations, and biometric signatures, her commands a blur of motion as she narrowed the search parameters. The terminal hummed, the ancient processors groaning under the strain of the complex modern search query. "Almost there," she muttered, her eyes locked on the scrolling data stream. "The files are massive, uncompressed. It's taking time to isolate the correct segment." Just as Janice's voice came through the comm again, this time more strained, "They've breached my first firewall. 30 seconds, maybe less." A single data packet on Lyra's screen flashed red. It was an anomaly, a file that should not have been there. It was a deeply encrypted medical file, cross-referenced with Bella's genetic markers, and flagged with a high-level security protocol that was far more advanced than anything used for simple palace security. Its access logs showed only one encryption key had ever been used to open it, Xyler's. With a surge of adrenaline, Lyra prioritized the new file, her instincts screaming that this was more important than anything else. As she worked to bypass the heavy encryption, she simultaneously located the security footage they had come for. "I've got it," she exclaimed, initiating the download of the large video file. "The footage is transferring now, and I've got something else wrong." Just as the transfer of the security footage completed, the lights in the maintenance hub flickered and died, and the legacy terminal went dark. "They've cut power to the entire sublevel," Lyra breathed in the sudden, absolute darkness. They know we're here." Before Richard could respond, the heavy metal door to the hub hissed open, silhouetting the massive, imposing frames of two security guards, their pulse rifles raised and leveled directly at them. But the guards did not fire. They stood frozen in the doorway, their attention suddenly diverted by a new, more urgent command crackling through their helmet comms. From her office, in a final, desperate act of misdirection, Janice had triggered a Level 1 fire suppression alert in the Spire's central data core, a catastrophic threat that automatically overrode all other security directives. "All units, report to the central core immediately." A new, panicked voice blared from their comms. "Containment breach in progress." The two guards exchanged a look of confused frustration. Then, with a final menacing glance at Richard and Lyra, they turned and ran, their heavy boots echoing down the corridor as they raced toward the manufactured crisis. The gambit had worked, buying them a few precious fleeting moments. Lyra, her hands shaking but her purpose clear, quickly rebooted her data slate on its own internal power. The encrypted medical file she had downloaded was now hers. She worked feverishly, her knowledge of back doors and legacy code giving her an edge against Zyler's modern, brute-force encryption. And then she was in. The contents of the file materialized on her screen, and a strangled gasp escaped her lips. Her face went pale, her eyes wide with a horrified disbelief that chilled Richard to the bone. The security footage they had risked everything for was now almost an afterthought, a triviality compared to the monstrous truth she had just uncovered. She slowly looked up from the glowing screen, her gaze meeting Richard's in the suffocating darkness. "Richard," she whispered, her voice trembling with the weight of her discovery. "Zyler's doctored footage. It wasn't just to frame you, it was a smokescreen. This whole thing, his power play, it was all to hide this." She turned the data slate toward him, the text on the screen a sickening, unbelievable revelation. "It's Bella's original diagnostic report, her condition. It wasn't a genetic anomaly. It was intentionally induced. The report details a custom-engineered retrovirus designed to attack the neuromuscular system of a developing child. According to this, someone poisoned her." The revelation hung in the cold, dusty air of the maintenance hub, a truth so monstrous it seemed to suck all the oxygen from the room. Richard stared at the words on the data slate, the clinical, technical language describing a crime of such profound cruelty that his mind struggled to process it. Poisoned. The word echoed in the sudden, ringing silence, a venomous, unthinkable reality that recontextualized years of suffering, a mother's endless grief, and a little girl's stolen childhood. The entire corporate conspiracy, the carefully crafted lies, the attack on his own character. It was all a grotesque piece of theater designed to distract from this one unforgivable sin. A white-hot rage, purer and more intense than any emotion he had ever felt, burned through his initial shock, forging his weary sadness into a diamond-hard resolve. He looked at Lyra, whose own face was a pale mask of horrified empathy, and saw his own fury reflected in her eyes. There was no need for discussion, no need for a plan. Their purpose was now singular and absolute. They had to get this information to Janice. The journey back through the Spire's mechanical guts was a blur, a tense, silent scramble fueled by adrenaline and a righteous fury that made them fearless. They moved with a desperate urgency, the damning evidence on Lyra's slate feeling like a physical weight, a sacred burden they had to carry back to the light. When they finally emerged from a service hatch into the polished, silent corridors of the upper levels, the contrast was jarring, the serene opulence of the palace a grotesque facade hiding the rot at its core. Richard contacted Janice immediately, his voice a low, urgent tremor in her ear, and a moment later she met them, her statuesque form sweeping into the corridor, her face a mask of controlled anxiety from the battle she had just fought in the digital realm. She saw the grim, shattered looks on their faces and knew instantly that they had found something far worse than doctored footage. Richard didn't need to explain. He simply handed her the data slate. Janice took it, her long, elegant fingers trembling almost imperceptibly as she read the contents of the file Lyra had decrypted. Richard watched as the color drained from her face, her flawless amethyst skin turning a sickly, ashen shade. Her violet eyes, usually so full of command and intelligence, widened in a slow, dawning horror, her breath catching in her throat as she read the clinical description of the retrovirus, the method of its delivery, and the name on the encryption key. For a long, terrifying moment she was utterly still, a statue carved from grief, the only sound in the hallway the faint, almost inaudible gasp that escaped her lips. Then the grief was burned away by an inferno. A wave of pure, undiluted fury washed over her features, so potent and so terrifying that Richard instinctively took a step back. The air around her seemed to crackle with a cold, lethal energy. The billionaire, the mother, the lover, they all vanished, and in their place stood an avenging angel, her eyes glowing with the promise of a reckoning that would be swift, absolute, and merciless. She did not weep. Her rage was too cold, too profound for tears. She looked up from the slate, her gaze meeting Richard's, and in that shared look a final, unbreakable pact was sealed. She then turned her gaze to Lyra, the small, trembling technician who had risked everything. "You have my gratitude," Janice said, her voice a low, dangerous whisper that held the chilling calm of a coming storm. "And you will have your justice, for your father and for my daughter." The emergency board meeting was convened not in the sterile, impersonal void of a holographic conference, but in the Spire's primary physical boardroom, a grand, intimidating chamber of polished obsidian and gleaming silver. Janice had demanded their physical presence, a summons that was so unusual and so absolute in its tone that no one dared to refuse. They arrived one by one, the most powerful beings in the sector, their faces a mixture of curiosity, greed, and arrogance, all of them vultures circling what they believed to be a dying beast. Xyler was the last to enter, moving with the languid, predatory grace of a man who believed he had already won. He took his seat at the head of the long table, opposite Janice, and gave her a smile that was all condescending pity, a final, theatrical twist of the knife before he delivered the killing blow. The meeting began as he expected, with Vorlag, the old reptilian, launching into a long, sanctimonious speech about corporate responsibility and the regrettable necessity of a change in leadership. Janice let him speak, her face an unreadable mask of calm, her hands steepled before her on the obsidian tabletop. She listened patiently as the accusations were leveled, as her judgment was questioned, as the wolves closed in for the kill. When Vorlag finally finished and the room fell into a pregnant, expectant silence, Janice did not offer a defense. She simply touched a control on her console. "Before we proceed to a vote," she said, her voice echoing with a chilling composure in the vast room, "I believe there is a piece of evidence you have not yet seen." The large holoscreen at the end of the room flickered to life, and the raw, undoctored footage from the playroom filled the space. The board members watched in stunned silence as the real events unfolded: Bella's distress, the staff's indifference, and Richard's simple, profound act of kindness. They saw him kneel. They saw him clean the child's face with a tenderness that was utterly at odds with the monster they had been led to believe he was, and they heard, for the first time, the faint, hesitant sound of Bella's laughter. The lie was exposed, the manipulation laid bare. A wave of murmurs swept through the room as uneasy glances were shot toward Xyler, whose condescending smile had faltered, replaced by a flicker of irritation. "A clever fabrication," he scoffed, attempting to regain control, "an emotional appeal designed to distract from the real security threat." But before he could build on the lie, Janice cut him off, her voice slicing through the air like a shard of glass. "You are right about one thing, Xyler. This was a distraction, but not from a security threat." She touched the console again, and the security footage was replaced by the cold, hard data from Bella's medical file. The complex biochemical diagrams and genetic sequences were meaningless to most of them, but the summary, which Janice had highlighted in stark, blood-red text, was unmistakable. "My daughter's condition was not a genetic anomaly," she announced, her voice resonating with a terrifying, righteous fury. "She was poisoned. Her nervous system was deliberately and systematically attacked by a custom-engineered retrovirus, administered shortly after her birth." A collective gasp went through the room. The corporate squabble was instantly forgotten, replaced by the sheer, unadulterated horror of the revelation. The goal was to create a permanent, debilitating condition that would ensure she could never inherit, never rule, Janice continued, her glowing violet eyes locking onto Zyler's, pinning him in his seat. A condition that would leave control of my entire fortune and this company in the hands of my consort in the event of my death or incapacitation. She let the final word hang in the air, a clear and damning accusation. She then brought up the file's access log, showing a single encryption key, a single name, glowing next to the monstrous data, Zyler. His handsome face contorted into a mask of pure, unadulterated panic. The carefully constructed world of lies and manipulation he had built around himself shattered into a million pieces. The board, composed of ruthless capitalists and corporate predators, stared at him with a new and profound revulsion. They could stomach hostile takeovers, market manipulation, even industrial espionage. But the premeditated crippling of a child for profit was a line of depravity that even they could not cross. His ruin was instantaneous and absolute. His allies abandoned him, his rivals looked upon him with contempt, and the power he had so desperately craved evaporated into nothing. Janice, with the full and immediate backing of a horrified board, stripped him of everything: his titles, his shares, his assets. And then, with a cold, final click of her console, she broadcast the evidence to the planetary authorities. The man who had entered the room a king left it in chains, his future a dark, endless abyss of justice. The story did not end with vengeance, but with healing. In the months that followed, the palace was transformed. The cold, sterile silence was permanently banished, replaced by the ever more frequent sound of Bella's laughter. Lyra, promoted to the head of a new, generously funded biotech division, dedicated herself completely to revering the damage the retrovirus had done. Using Zyler's own research as a foundation, she worked with a relentless, inspired passion, driven by the memory of her father and the hope she saw growing in Bella's eyes. The process was slow, filled with painstaking therapy and small, incremental victories, but it was a process of hope, not despair. Richard remained the constant, steady center of their new world. He was no longer a janitor, but he was not a corporate executive either. He was simply Richard, Janice's partner, Bella's staunchest ally, the quiet, unshakable heart of their family. He spent his days not cleaning floors, but helping Bella with her grueling physical therapy, his patient strength and unwavering encouragement giving her the courage to fight. One bright afternoon, long after the scandal of Zyler had faded into a dark memory, the three of them were in the Biodome Garden, their private sanctuary. Lyra's treatments had worked a miracle. Bella stood between Janice and Richard, her small hands gripping theirs tightly. Her legs, once frail and useless, were still weak, but they were hers again. She took a slow, wobbly step, then another, a small, triumphant journey across the soft grass. Janice watched, tears of pure, unadulterated joy streaming down her face for the first time in years. This was the one thing her trillions of credits could never have bought, a simple, perfect moment of happiness. She looked at Richard, his kind, hazel eyes filled with a love that was more precious than any jewel, and she knew she was finally home. The glittering palace was no longer a cage, but a haven, its grand halls filled not with the echoes of loneliness, but with the promise of a future they would build together, one step at a time.